the Interesting Conversations with Interesting People podcast series with author Nigel Beckles.
Welcome to the podcast.
Please like the podcast and subscribe to this channel. Thank you. The very best way to promote your podcasts. Podpage makes it easy to create a podcast website with just a few clicks. Every page is optimized to be found on Google and it stays up to date forever. For more information, visit podpage.com. The future of podcast promotion.
Have you experienced several failed relationships or been through a divorce? How can you avoid making the same mistakes again? How to avoid making the big relationship mistakes is out now.
Hi, my name is Nigel Beckles. My new book is packed with practical and common sense strategies that you can use to make better relationship choices.
Now you can discover the dangerous myths about love. If your relationship expectations are realistic, why you could be falling in love for all the wrong reasons.
How to avoid making the big relationship mistakes. It's a book that could change your life.
Available from Amazon.co.uk. Kindle version also available.
When the Mood is Right, A Poetry Journey and Mood Swings by Queen P. Available on Amazon and all good bookstores.
The Royal Affair
by Queen P.
Dim the lights, sit back, relax, and breathe. You have entered into the Royal Affair.
Queen P. Poetry podcasts. Available now.
The Royal Affair.
Get ready for takeoff.
Welcome back to my Interesting Conversations with Interesting People podcast series. My guest for this episode has been a caregiver for several decades and also an author, American Eli Shaw. Hi Eli, welcome to my podcast series.
Thank you for interviewing me.
So, where do you live at the moment?
I live in Vermont in the United States. I live in a town called Barrie.
Did you grow up there?
No, I grew up in Rhode Island. It's the smallest state in the Union, or in the United States. And I grew up there until I was in my 20s, I guess. About 26, I left. And I started traveling around and doing a lot of different things there.
So what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in Rhode Island, and in the towns that I lived in, there were little villages. It was like mill towns. Each mill or factory had its own culture practically. The area where I lived, which was called Clyde, that was mostly Portuguese. They had a Portuguese church. They had Portuguese festivals and that type of thing. And so I got really exposed to different cultures and different lifestyles very early on. And part of what my experience as a caregiver came when I was about 10 years old. My first person with a disability who had what we call now Down syndrome, but then it was called Mongoloidism. But I thought he was Chinese. And I told my mother I had a Chinese friend, and she said to invite him over. So I did. After he left, she basically explained to me that he had Mongoloidism, which I didn't quite understand. So when I looked it up in the encyclopedia, it said the word came from Mongolia, which is because of the facial features of Down syndrome, which was very similar to Mongolian population. And so after that, I told everybody I had a friend from Mongolia. And I basically became his friend, his mentor. I kept him away from the bullies. If they started bullying him, I would step in and try to make sure he didn't get hurt. The childhood I had was very different from what we have today, I would say. But we had chickens. I raised pigeons. My mother and father both insisted that I get included in as many things outside of the house as possible. So I became very outgoing in that area. One of the incidents that happened with my friend Charlie, who had Down syndrome, I asked him if he was going to go to camp because I was going to camp that year. And he said, no, they don't take people like me, which I didn't quite understand at that time, 10 years old. So I went to camp, and when I came back, he had left. His father was in the military, and they had moved away. So I thought, at 10 years old, I thought I did something wrong or it was my fault or whatever. Apparently, I told my mother that I was going to do something to change the way people treated kids like him, which I don't remember, but she insists I said that. And when I turned 19, I was with a group of teenagers would take kids like him out to the movies or whatever and activities. I had heard that several times from other kids that they didn't go to camp because they didn't take people like him. So I decided I'm going to create a camp. Basically, it was completely run by teenagers and funded by teenagers because the adults insisted that we wouldn't be able to do it because we were teenagers. At that time, it was the hippie movement and drugs were on the scene. LSD was the big thing, and teenagers weren't really respected that much. They were respected, but there was always that question, are they on drugs or whatever? There was always a question. So I got together with this group of teenagers, and we ended up having a camp with 30 teenagers as counselors and 60 kids with disabilities. In 2019, we had our 50th reunion, which was really amazing because I got to meet a lot of the kids that were at the camp in 1969, 50 years later, which was quite the experience. It was amazing.
Well, you've been a caregiver for many years. How do you cope when someone you were providing caregiving to passes away?
That's an interesting question because over the years, I've been at the death of many, many people. 80s and 90s when I was working with people with HIV, I worked with a group of teenagers and basically they had been homeless or on the street anyway. We interviewed about 300 kids and about 22 kids signed up for a program that we did. And the program was basically we would provide housing and food and education and whatnot, and also healthcare as long as they were able to work together with us and become peer educators and go into the schools and talk to the kids in school. So that worked out pretty well. And then one by one, they had been getting sicker and sicker. And over a period of about 3 years, I guess it was, almost all of them had passed away, and I was at their deathbed. In the beginning, I got kind of really upset about it. It really bothered me. I got very emotional about it because of their age mostly. And but as I went along, I started to really look at death as such an amazing transformation. It's something that we can't escape, obviously. And I really wanted to look at death in a way that I could feel at least comfortable and look at it more in a positive way. And that, what I found was when I started doing that, looking at it in a positive way, feeling good about it, not good about them dying, but more accepting of it, I started to realize that the people that were dying that I was working with were dying better, if you want to call it that. In other words, they were, I want to say more accepting of the fact that they were dying, but I think they were more at ease with it. When I noticed that the people who were on their last days or whatever, and people were coming in and crying and upset and whatnot, it only added to their stress, which added to their fear of death. And, that whole process of dying became almost a tragedy in itself. And then as I went along, I started to realize how beautiful it was. One of my best friends died of AIDS. I was with him. I was holding his hand when he died. And he knew he was going. We talked about it a long time. I was a little distressed when he did die, but what I found was that it was a sense of peace, a sense of relaxation. His body was not in pain anymore. And I could feel his hand. I could feel some energy in his hand where, eventually his hand got looser and looser and looser, and then it just dropped. It was kind of an experience for me. And even though I was very upset, I was more relaxed and at ease with the whole idea of him passing away. Of course, I missed him and whatnot. At that point, I thought I handled it. I handled death. I passed the test or whatever. And what happened just recently, about a year ago, I was working with a guy who I had been with for 27 years. I was his caregiver. He had cerebral palsy. And in fact, I'm writing a book about him right now. It's called Nate the Great. And during COVID, he was, as a person, he was very social. He really kind of thrived on meeting people. And our favorite place was the grocery store because he would always meet somebody he knew there. And in the towns we have in Vermont, there's not that very many places to go. And the grocery store is, it can be fun. So he would always go with me to the grocery store, and he was very, very social. During COVID, No one was allowed to come into the house. His mother was in her 80s or just turned 80 now. And it was hard for her to get him out of bed. So no one was coming in to visit him. I was on the phone with him, at least 4 or 5 times a day. And what I realized was that he was starting to fade away. When I would joke with him, he wouldn't laugh as much, or he would be a little more irritated about things. And then I called him on Thanksgiving Day and I said, well, I'll be down tomorrow to visit you. I'm going to spend some time with you. And he didn't say anything. And then I made a couple of jokes and he didn't laugh. And his mother said, well, he's smiling anyway. And so I thought that was kind of strange because he always like had a belly laugh whenever I was joking with him. So I thought that was kind of strange. And then the next morning she called me up and his mother said, no, Nathan didn't make it this morning. He passed away about 6 o'clock this morning. And at first I was like, okay, I can handle this. What I found was that his death was probably the hardest death I've had so far. I think because of his age, I think because of my interaction with him, where I was with him almost every day for 27 years, except during COVID. And I would put him to bed every single night. We would, watch TV every night. It was just one of those things where he taught me more about caregiving as a caregiver and what I should be doing. For example, I would walk in when I first started working with him. I would walk in and say, oh, man, Nathan, I had the worst day. And he's not interested in that. I mean, that's fine. But he would look at me as if to say, well, you think you had a bad day? You lay in bed and look at the damn ceiling all night, all day long, because he couldn't move. He could move his arms, but there was no control. So I would have to pick him up and put him in the wheelchair. And that's how we would be mobile. So what I started to realize was that when I came in a positive attitude, I would leave all my baggage outside the door and I would walk in and I would talk to him and I would say, hey, Nate, how you doing? What's happening? Hey, you look great today. What's going on? Everything as positive as I could. And what happened was my relationship with him changed completely. It was like, we had a great time together. He wasn't upset. I wasn't upset. We just turned that relationship into a totally positive relationship. If he was down or whatever, I had this trick where I would open up the closet door and walk in as if I was walking out the door. And I would shut the door and I'm standing inside his closet and I could hear him, in his bed and I could hear him giggling. So I would tap on the door and I'd say, Nathan, can I come out? I think I went in the wrong door. And he'd start laughing like crazy. So I learned all about, how to redirect his attitude with humor, which carried me a long way because a lot of people that I work with, I do the same thing with.
Well, Eli, you are also an author. What is your book called and what is it about?
My book is called If I Die Before I Wake, A Caregiver's Journey. And it's basically a memoir of a 63-year journey that I took as a caregiver. I started out when I was 10 years old, as I said, with Charlie, the boy with Down syndrome. And it goes through a whole series of events during the time when we had institutions, mental institutions. We had many of them around, and I used to call them warehouses, human warehouses, because as I was working in some of them, I realized that a lot of the people that were in there were brilliant. And because of the fact that they were either physically not acceptable in the community or they may not be, their behavior may be off or whatever, many of those kids and adults were put into institutions. I was working in one of those institutions and I just thought it was crazy because they were treated like animals in many ways. It just bothered me that they were living in those conditions. And to go outside, they had to go into a caged-in area. I mean, literally, they were in a cage. It was a fence that went around, and then they had the fence on top of over it, so that it was almost like they were a caged animal. So I used to sneak them out into the field, and we would play football. I taught them how to play football before we went out. And we would go play football, and I knew if I got caught, I would be suspended. But I took them out anyway. And one day, one of the kids threw the ball too far, and the administration saw them. So they came over and asked why he was out there, and I told them, why did you bring the kids out there? And I said, well, I don't like the fact that they're caged in like this. And I think with the right supervision, they can work them out into the community. So he says, well, we're going to have to suspend you for a couple of weeks. So in 2 weeks, come back to work. So I said, okay. So I left. I came back and I said, well, am I fired or what? And he said, no, we're going to give you a raise. And we're also going to head you up. You're going to head up a program to study what we can do to get these kids out into the community or out into the open air more. And so I was able to head up a program that we would create paths in the woods, or the residents would actually help build these paths in the woods and trails so that they could go walking in the woods if they wanted. So I did that. And then right around that time, I call it the big exodus, was when community, they were starting to understand that it was sad that they were put into these institutions. And why can't we, open up group homes or whatever so they could live a normal life? And so we started opening up group homes. Everybody who was in the institutions were eventually brought into the community through group homes or families that would take them in, or their own families.
I understand you've met some famous people. Who have you met?
Bette Midler and also Whoopie Goldberg. Whoopi was many years ago in the 80s, a sketch that she did, and it was called Luxuriously Blonde Flowing Hair. And it was a satire on her being black, and everybody on TV was white. So she was trying to imitate the people on the TV. So she had a mop on her hair, and, she was pretending she was the little girl and saying, "Do you love my luxuriously blonde flowing hair?" And her mother, she played her mother also, and she said, "Take that damn thing off your head." "But Mom, this is my luxuriously blonde flowing hair." She goes, "And I'm going to be on TV." She said, "There's no black people on TV." And her satire was so powerful. It was quite a few years later, in the 90s, she was in A Funny Thing Happened to Me on the Way to the Forum. And she was one of the leads there. She came out afterwards to sign autographs. I told her that I remembered her with the luxuriously blonde flowing hair. And she basically just stood there still and looked at me. And she goes, "Do you realize you're the only person that's ever said anything to me about that show?" And apparently she only did it like 3 or 4 nights or whatever, and put her arm around my neck and walked me over. And she said, "If you're not doing anything later on, I'm going to a little restaurant down the way there. Maybe we can talk. I'd love to talk to somebody who's seen that." And the same thing happened with Bette Midler. After the show, I stayed talking to some people there, and she came out on stage. As she was standing there, she stayed there, and she looked directly at me. I don't know why. And she said, "What the hell are you doing here?" So I just responded, and we started talking for a little bit. And I got to meet Gene Moore, who was the window designer for Tiffany's. And Matthew Broderick was the brother of his sister, is a minister, and my best friend, who's a minister, was her best friend. So we ended up going out to eat together. And so I've got pictures of them. I met Cynthia Lennon, John Lennon's wife, in the early 80s with the Beatles convention. I got pictures of her. We just went out to dinner one night.
So Eli, how can people contact you?
They can contact me through my website. The website is authorilishaw.com. AuthorElishaw.com. And it's all one word. Or they can get me at my email, which is bkershaw, BKERSHAW 5607 @gmail.com. If they get me through the email, I send out a signed copy if they want.
Eli in Vermont, USA. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share. Another In Conversation podcast coming soon.